Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The rain started lightly that evening, a gentle pattering against the window of the old house tucked deep within the woods. It was a sound most would have found comforting, soothing even, but for Claire, it was just another reminder that she was alone. The house had been her grandmother's, a creaking, sprawling relic that sat untouched for years after her passing. Now it was Claire's, and with nowhere else to go, she decided to spend the summer cleaning it out and deciding what to do with the place. She hadn't been there in over a decade, not since she was a child. The house felt bigger now, more imposing. Its walls seemed to stretch higher, its shadows darker, its silence deeper. It was the kind of house that held memories, not all of them pleasant, and as Claire wandered its halls, she could almost feel the weight of its history pressing down on her. She had arrived just before dusk, the sunlight filtering weakly through the canopy of trees that surrounded the property. The driveway was overgrown, the front porch sagging slightly, the windows streaked with grime. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. It was exactly as she remembered it, and yet not. The first night passed uneventfully. Claire unpacked a few things, made herself a simple dinner, and sat in the living room with a book, listening to the rain grow heavier as the night deepened. She had always loved storms, and the sound of the rain drumming on the roof was oddly soothing. But as the hours crept by, an unease settled over her. It was the kind of unease that was difficult to define. A prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. By the time she went to bed, the rain had turned into a relentless downpour, and the wind howled through the trees outside. Claire told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the house, the memories it stirred, but sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned for what felt like hours, her dreams restless and fragmented when they finally came. The second day was uneventful as well. Claire spent most of it cleaning, sorting through boxes of old photographs, letters, and trinkets that her grandmother had hoarded over the years. There were moments of warmth as she came across pictures of her as a child, playing in the garden or baking cookies in the kitchen. But there were other things too. Things that didn't make sense. A photo of her grandmother standing in front of the house with a man Claire didn't recognize. His face was blurred, not by time or damage to the photo, but as though he had never been clear to begin with. A letter addressed to her grandmother, written in shaky handwriting, warning her to leave the house immediately. No explanation, just a desperate plea. An old key, heavy and ornate, with no indication of what it might open. By the time night fell again, the unease from the previous night had returned, stronger this time. The rain was still falling, a steady, unrelenting rhythm, and the wind had picked up again. Claire decided to call it an early night, hoping that sleep would come easier this time. It didn't. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the occasional creak of the house settling. At first, the sound seemed normal. The groan of the old wood, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant roll of thunder. But then there were other sounds. Footsteps. They were faint at first, so faint that Claire thought she might have imagined them. But as she held her breath and strained to listen, she heard them again. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor downstairs. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, her mind racing. She had locked the doors, hadn't she? She was sure she had. Grabbing her phone, she checked the time, 2:13 a.m., and debated whether to call the police. But what would she tell them? That she thought she heard footsteps in an old, creaky house? Summoning her courage, Claire slipped out of bed and crept to the door of her room, opening it just enough to peer down the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window at the end of the hall. The house was silent now, save for the rain. She stepped out into the hallway, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet, and made her way to the stairs. Every step felt agonizingly loud, the creak of the wood cutting through the silence. When she reached the bottom, she paused, listening. Nothing. Claire let out a shaky breath and flipped on the light in the living room. It flickered once, twice, before holding steady, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Everything was as she had left it. The door was locked. The windows were shut. But the uneasy feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind. As she turned to head back upstairs, her eyes caught something in the reflection of the window. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to notice her, but it was there, unmistakably human. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she call for help? Confront them? Before she could decide, the light flickered again, and when she looked back, the figure was gone. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she ran upstairs and locked herself in her room. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting up in bed with the light on, clutching the heavy key she had found earlier as though it might somehow protect her. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to let up, and Claire's exhaustion caught up with her. She drifted off into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with shadows and whispers. When she woke, the key was gone. Claire's eyes darted across the room, scanning every corner for the key. She had fallen asleep with it clutched tightly in her hand, but now it was nowhere to be found. The pale morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, illuminating the room in a dull gray haze. She checked the bed, the nightstand, even the floor beneath her. Nothing. A wave of unease washed over her. The key wasn't just missing, it had been taken. But by who? She had locked her door, hadn't she? Gripping her phone tightly, she checked the time. 6:47 a.m. The house was eerily silent now, the rain reduced to a faint drizzle. Her mind replayed the events of the night before. The footsteps, the figure in the woods, the flickering light. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare that had bled into reality. Forcing herself to move, Claire got out of bed and carefully unlocked her door. The hallway was as still as she had left it, the old wooden floor bathed in soft morning light. She made her way downstairs, pausing to listen at every step, but the house remained silent. Her first stop was the living room. The furniture was untouched, the windows locked, the door bolted. She checked the front porch, scanning the overgrown yard and the edge of the forest beyond. There was no sign of anyone, but as she stepped back inside, her eyes caught something on the floor. A single muddy footprint, small and faint, leading away from the front door and into the kitchen. Her stomach tightened. The kitchen was dim, the curtains drawn tightly shut. Claire flipped on the light, half expecting it to flicker like before, but it stayed on. The footprint ended abruptly near the center of the room, as though the person had simply vanished. And then she saw it. The key. It was sitting on the kitchen table, polished and gleaming, as though it had just been placed there. Claire stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. She hadn't left it there. She was certain of that. Cautiously, she approached the table and picked up the key. It felt heavier than before, the metal cold against her skin. As she turned it over in her hand, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, an inscription, faint and worn, etched along the shaft of the key. What is locked must stay locked. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The message sent a chill down her spine. She didn't remember seeing it the first time she found the key, but then again, she hadn't looked at it too closely. What did it mean? What was locked? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint creak coming from upstairs. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of the house, it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was up there. Claire's grip tightened around the key as she slowly made her way back up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, her breath shallow and quick. The creaking grew louder as she approached the landing, leading her toward the end of the hallway where the attic door was. The attic. She hadn't been up there yet. She had barely thought about it since arriving. The door was a small, unassuming panel in the ceiling, with a pull cord dangling down. It had been there for as long as she could remember, but her grandmother had always kept it locked, saying it was just a storage space. But now, as Claire stood beneath it, she noticed something strange. The pull cord was swaying gently, as though it had just been disturbed. Swallowing her fear, she reached up and grabbed the cord, pulling it down. The door creaked open, revealing a rickety ladder that extended into the dark space above. A musty, metallic smell wafted down, making her stomach turn. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Claire climbed the ladder, the old wood groaning under her weight. The attic was dim, the only light coming from a small, circular window on the far wall. Dust motes floated in the air, and the floor was cluttered with boxes and old furniture. But it wasn't the clutter that caught her attention. It was the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its gilded frame tarnished with age. The glass was clouded, but Claire could still make out her reflection, or at least, she thought it was her reflection. As she stepped closer, her reflection didn't move. Claire froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure in the mirror was her, but it wasn't. Its eyes were darker, its face gaunt, its expression twisted into a cold, cruel smile. And then it moved. The reflection raised its hand, pointing directly at Claire. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a faint whisper that seemed to echo in her mind. The key unlocks. Claire stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box behind her. The figure in the mirror watched her, its grin widening. She wanted to run, to scream, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut below her, the sound reverberating through the room. The reflection laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. Claire didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the mirror, before the figure finally disappeared, leaving only her pale, terrified reflection behind. But the whisper lingered in her mind. The key unlocks, and she knew, deep down, that whatever it unlocked, it wasn't meant to be opened. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the key tighter, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. The attic felt colder now, the musty air thick with an oppressive weight. She needed to get out of there, but the mirror held her in place, its presence commanding her attention like a predator to its prey. Her reflection stared back at her now, normal but unnerving all the same. The memory of its twisted grin burned into her mind. She edged backward, her breath hitching when her foot nudged something on the floor. She looked down to see a small wooden box, half hidden beneath an old blanket. Its surface was carved with intricate patterns, similar to the etching on the key. Claire hesitated, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. Kneeling down, she set the key aside for a moment and gently opened the box. Inside was a collection of old photographs and letters, each yellowed with age. The photos were faded, but the subjects were clear enough. Her grandmother, much younger, standing in front of the house with a man Claire didn't recognize. His face was stern, almost severe, and his eyes had a piercing quality that made her uneasy. She shifted through the letters, her fingers brushing over the brittle paper. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, the ink smudged in places. One letter, in particular, caught her attention. To whomever finds this, do not open the door. The mirror is the gateway. The key is its anchor. Once it is unlocked, it cannot be undone. Claire's blood ran cold as the meaning of the words sank in. The mirror. The key. Her grandmother had kept this hidden for a reason, and now Claire was tangled in whatever nightmare she had tried to suppress. A sudden creak made her spin around, her heart pounding. The attic was still, but the air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching her. She quickly shoved the letters back into the box and grabbed the key, her mind racing. The mirror loomed behind her, silent but menacing. Claire refused to look at it as she descended the ladder, her footsteps hurried and clumsy. She stumbled into the hallway, slamming the attic door shut and locking it with trembling hands. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the tense silence. She fumbled to pull it out, relief flooding her when she saw a text from her friend Alice. Alice. Hey, are you okay? Haven't heard from you. Want me to come over? Claire's fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to say yes, to beg Alice to come and save her from this nightmare. But something stopped her, a nagging feeling that this was something she had to face alone. Claire, I'm fine. Just dealing with some family stuff. I'll call you later. The message felt hollow, but she sent it anyway. She couldn't drag Alice into this, not when she didn't even understand it herself. As the day wore on, the rain returned, heavier than before. The house felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in around her. Every creak and groan of the old wood made her jump, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. By evening, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She sat at the kitchen table, the key in front of her, and stared at it as if it might reveal its secrets. The inscription echoed in her mind. What is locked must stay locked. Her grandmother had known something, had fought to keep whatever was tied to the key contained. But now it was Claire's burden, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to bear it. The sound of shattering glass snapped her out of her thoughts. She bolted upright, her eyes darting to the source. The living room window was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The rain poured in, soaking the carpet. Claire grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She shone the beam across the window, expecting to see a branch or maybe an animal. But there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and still, the rain falling in heavy sheets. And then she saw them. Footprints, wet and muddy, leading from the broken window to the base of the stairs. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The prints were small, like a child's, and they glistened faintly in the dim light. She backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like tiny fingers drumming against wood. It was coming from upstairs. Claire's instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But something deeper, some inexplicable pull, urged her to follow the sound. She couldn't leave, not without understanding what was happening. Clutching the key like a talisman, she climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tapping grew louder as she approached the end of the hallway, where the door to her grandmother's old bedroom stood slightly ajar. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a room cloaked in shadows. The rain outside cast strange patterns on the walls, and the air felt thick with an unnatural chill. And then she saw it. The mirror. It was there, standing in the corner, though she had left it locked in the attic. Its glass was dark, almost black, and her reflection was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the figure stood there, the same twisted version of herself, grinning that cruel, inhuman grin. The tapping stopped, and the figure stepped out of the mirror. Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the figure emerged fully from the mirror. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unsettling angle. Though it looked like her, it wasn't her. Its eyes glimmered with malice, and the twisted grin stretched impossibly wide across its face. The figure tilted its head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, in a voice that was almost hers but layered with something deeper, something wrong, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, the words echoing unnaturally, as if they came from the walls themselves. Claire's legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as the thing took a step toward her. She clutched the key tighter, the cool metal digging into her palm. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced. The warning from the letter, "Do not open the door. The key is its anchor. What do you want?" Claire's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The figure paused, its grin fading into a look of mockery. "You already know the answer," it said, gesturing toward the key in her hand. "You hold the anchor. You hold the choice." Claire shook her head, her mind racing. The attic, the box, the mirror. Everything pointed to this moment, but she couldn't piece it together. What choice? "I don't understand." The figure let out a low, guttural laugh that made her skin crawl. "Of course you don't, but you will." Without warning, it lunged toward her, its movements so fast they were a blur. Claire screamed, stumbling backward and raising the key instinctively as if it were a weapon. The moment the metal made contact with the figure's outstretched hand, a deafening screech filled the room. The creature recoiled, smoke rising from its hand as if the key had burned it. Claire didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her bare feet slipping on the wooden floor as she ran. The house seemed to come alive around her, doors slamming shut on their own, the walls groaning and shifting as if the house itself were trying to trap her. She reached the attic door and yanked it open, scrambling up the ladder with the key still clutched in her trembling hand. The attic was darker than before, the single light bulb flickering erratically. The mirror stood where she had left it, its surface rippling like black water. The figure's laughter echoed below, growing louder as it ascended the stairs. Claire's heart pounded as she stared at the mirror, her mind racing for a solution. The letters had warned about the key, but they hadn't told her what to do with it. All she knew was that the mirror and the key were connected. The figure's footsteps grew louder, and Claire could hear its distorted voice taunting her from below. "You can't run forever, Claire. This is your destiny." Desperation clawed at her. She had to act, but how? The mirror rippled again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw her grandmother's face staring back at her, her expression solemn. Suddenly, Claire remembered the inscription on the key. "What is locked must stay locked." If the key was the anchor, then perhaps locking the mirror again was the only way to stop this. With shaking hands, she approached the mirror. The air around it was cold, biting at her skin. The closer she got, the louder the figure's laughter became, as if it knew what she was about to do. The figure appeared at the base of the attic ladder, its twisted grin illuminated by the flickering light. "Don't," it warned, its voice losing the mocking tone and replaced with something raw and desperate. "You don't know what you're doing." Claire ignored it, forcing herself to stand her ground. The key fit perfectly into the slot at the base of the mirror, the metal clicking into place as if it had always belonged there. The mirror began to vibrate, the rippling surface churning like a stormy sea. The figure screamed, a sound that was both human and not, its form twisting and contorting as it tried to climb the ladder. "No, you can't. You'll trap us both." Claire hesitated, her hand trembling on the key. "What do you mean?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure's grin returned, but it was weaker now, its body fading in and out of focus. "I'm you," it whispered. "The part of you that was meant to stay hidden. Lock the mirror, and you lock me. Forever." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she turned the key. The mirror's surface convulsed violently, pulling the figure toward it like a vortex. It screamed and clawed at the floorboards, but the force was too strong. With one final piercing wail, it was sucked into the mirror, leaving nothing behind but silence. The mirror's surface stilled, turning black and solid once more. The key clicked, locking into place, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Claire collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, everything was quiet. The rain outside had stopped, and the house felt still, almost peaceful. Claire stared at the mirror, her reflection finally staring back at her. Normal, human. She knew she couldn't stay in the house. The secrets it held were too dangerous, too dark. She would leave, sell the property, and never look back. But as she descended the attic ladder for the last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. And in the silence of the attic, the locked mirror stood as a silent witness, its surface smooth and black, hiding whatever secrets still lingered within. Claire left the attic, descending the creaky ladder with the key still clutched in her hand. Her heart pounded, and her legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But the house was silent now. No creaking walls, no phantom voices, no distorted figures lurking in the shadows. Even the rain outside had dwindled to a soft drizzle. She stood in the hallway, her breath ragged, and glanced back toward the attic. The door hung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. For the first time in hours, perhaps the first time since she had arrived, she felt a flicker of relief. It was over. It had to be over. But the moment she thought it, a faint noise echoed through the house. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping sound, as though someone or something was testing the strength of a barrier. Came from above, from the attic. No, Claire whispered to herself, backing away. No, it's locked. I locked it. Her grip on the key tightened, and she forced herself to move. She couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever she had unleashed, whatever she had locked away, it wasn't her responsibility anymore. She had done what she could. She had survived. She reached the staircase and began descending, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself didn't want her to leave. When she reached the bottom, she glanced toward the front door. It was just a few steps away. Freedom, safety, a world that made sense. But her gaze shifted to the living room, to the small wooden box that still sat on the coffee table. The box that had started it all. Her stomach churned. She should leave it. She should walk out the door and never look back. Yet, something compelled her to move toward it, as if an invisible thread were pulling her closer. The box was innocent looking, its aged wood and brass latch giving no indication of the chaos it had caused. Claire hesitated, then reached out and picked it up. It felt heavier than before, as if the contents had changed. She didn't open it. She couldn't. But as she held it, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier, an inscription carved faintly into the underside of the lid. What is forgotten is not gone. Her breath caught in her throat. The word sent a shiver down her spine, colder than any ghostly touch. They were a warning, a reminder that whatever had been locked away in the attic wasn't truly defeated. It was contained, yes, but not destroyed. She set the box down carefully, almost reverently, and turned toward the door. She needed to leave now. The house wasn't safe, and she couldn't risk being here any longer. The key in her hand felt warm, almost alive, as if it had absorbed some of the energy from the mirror. Claire didn't know what to do with it. She couldn't bring it with her. It felt too dangerous, too connected to the horrors of the house. But she also couldn't leave it behind. What if someone else found it? What if they tried to use it? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a solution. Then she saw it, the fireplace. The embers from earlier had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow among the ashes. Without giving herself time to second guess, she walked over to the hearth and knelt down. The key felt heavier now, as if it were resisting her decision. She hesitated, her mind racing with doubt. Was this the right thing to do? What if destroying the key only made things worse? But the memory of the figure, the twisted, malevolent version of herself, pushed her forward. She couldn't let that thing escape. Not ever. With a deep breath, she tossed the key into the fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a sharp, high-pitched sound filled the room, like metal screaming as it melted. The flames flared bright, almost white, before dying back down to their previous glow. The key was gone. Claire sat back, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. Whatever connection the key had to the mirror, to the creature, was severed. She hoped. She stood and walked to the front door, her steps slow and deliberate. The house seemed quieter now, almost peaceful, as if it were relieved to be rid of her. She opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the world damp and fresh. The car was where she had left it, waiting like a lifeline at the end of the gravel driveway. She climbed in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As the house disappeared in her rearview mirror, she felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. relief that she had survived, sorrow for whatever had happened to her grandmother, for the secrets that had died with her. But as she drove into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over, that the mirror, the house, and whatever lurked within it were still watching, still waiting. And somewhere, in the quiet attic of that old house, the mirror sat in its locked frame, its surface smooth and black, hiding whatever truths it refused to reveal. Claire drove in silence, the hum of the engine and the gentle swish of the windshield wipers the only sounds breaking the stillness. The world outside seemed strangely calm, almost too calm, as if the storm that had raged earlier was nothing more than a bad memory. But inside, her thoughts churned like a restless sea. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something unfinished, that the house wasn't truly done with her. Miles passed, and the tension in her chest slowly began to ease. The key was destroyed, the mirror was locked, and she was free. Or so she told herself. Yet, as her mind replayed the events of the night, she began to notice something strange. There were gaps, moments that felt fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. She remembered the attic, the figure in the mirror, the feeling of being watched. But there were other moments, fleeting and fragmented, that eluded her grasp. A voice whispering her name. A shadow that moved just out of sight. A cold hand brushing against her skin. The road stretched ahead of her, dark and empty. Her headlights carved a narrow path through the night, illuminating the wet asphalt and the occasional silhouette of trees. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 3 a.m. The late hour weighed heavily on her, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading fast. As she rounded a bend, a sudden flicker of movement caught her eye. She slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded to a halt, and for a moment she sat frozen, staring into the darkness ahead. Something was standing in the road. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in the shadows of the night, but it was unmistakably there. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood motionless, its outline blurred by the rain-slicked pavement. Claire's first instinct was to reverse, to get as far away from whatever this was as possible. But as her hand moved to the gear shift, the figure stepped forward into the beam of her headlights. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her. The same distorted version of herself she had seen in the attic mirror. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes dark pits that seemed to pull her in. It wore the same clothes as her, but they were tattered and stained, as if it had been wandering through some nightmarish landscape. Its lips twisted into a mockery of a smile, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. Claire's heart raced, and she fought the urge to scream. This couldn't be real. She had destroyed the key, locked the mirror. It was over, wasn't it? The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. It pointed at her, its skeletal finger trembling slightly, and then it spoke. The voice was hers, but wrong, like a recording played backward and distorted. You cannot escape. Claire's hand shook as she fumbled with the gear shift, slamming it into reverse. The car lurched backward, its tires squealing against the wet pavement. But as she reversed, the figure began to move toward her. Its steps slow but deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." She shifted into drive and floored the accelerator. The car shot forward, barreling toward the figure. She didn't want to hit it, didn't want to know what would happen if she did, but she had no other choice. She couldn't let it reach her. But just as the car was about to collide with it, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Claire's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she drove on, her eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. The road behind her was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every flicker of light a potential threat. The thought hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't left it behind. Whatever had been in that house, whatever she had locked away, it was still with her. She didn't know how or why, but it had followed her. The realization sent a cold wave of fear crashing over her. She couldn't go home, couldn't risk bringing this thing into her life, into her world. But where could she go? What could she do? Her mind raced, and she found herself driving toward the only place that made sense, the old church at the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, its doors locked and its windows boarded up, but it was a place of sanctuary, of protection. If anywhere could keep her safe, it was there. As the church came into view, its weathered steeple looming against the dark sky, Claire felt a flicker of hope. She pulled into the overgrown parking lot and killed the engine, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaky, and approached the heavy wooden doors. They groaned as she pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. Claire moved to the altar, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt drawn here, as if some unseen force had guided her. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped together, and closed her eyes. She didn't pray, she hadn't prayed in years, but she whispered a plea into the darkness, a desperate request for help, for protection. But the silence that followed was deafening, and then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Claire froze. The cold grip on her shoulder sent icy tendrils down her spine, rooting her in place. She couldn't bring herself to turn around, couldn't face what she knew was standing behind her. The silence in the church grew heavy, oppressive, as though the very air had been sucked out. "Claire," a voice whispered, soft yet guttural, its tone dripping with malice. It was her own voice, but twisted wrong, like a shattered mirror reflecting fragments of something sinister. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered back, "What do you want from me?" The hand released her, but she could feel the presence lingering. It moved around her, slow and deliberate, as though savoring her fear. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of its form, a shadow that seemed to shift and pulse, barely tethered to the world. "You brought me here," the voice replied, echoing through the cavernous church. "You called me when you entered that house. You opened the door, and now I'm free." Claire shook her head, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "I didn't mean to. I destroyed the key. I locked the mirror." The shadow laughed, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the church. "It was never about the key, Claire. It was about you. You are the key. You always were." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she stumbled back, clutching the edge of the altar for support. "No, that's not possible." The shadow surged toward her, its form solidifying into the twisted version of herself she had seen on the road. It loomed over her, its dark, empty eyes boring into hers. "You carry the mirror with you now. It's inside you. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, you cannot escape me. Claire's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The fragmented memories, the sense of being followed, the figure on the road, it had all been leading to this. She wasn't just a victim of the house's curse. She was part of it. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a cruel smile spreading across its face. "Embrace me. Accept what you've become. Or fight me, and watch as I consume everything you love." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. She couldn't let this thing take over, couldn't let it hurt anyone else. But how could she fight something that was a part of her? Her eyes fell on the altar, and an idea began to form. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. With trembling hands, she reached for the heavy candlestick that rested beside the altar. The shadow seemed to sense her intent. "You think you can banish me with that?" it sneered. "No," Claire replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I can make sure you stay here." Before the shadow could react, she swung the candlestick with all her strength, striking the nearest stained glass window. The glass shattered in a cascade of colorful shards, letting the cold night air rush in. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice a mixture of anger and fear. Claire didn't answer. She moved to the next window and shattered it, then another, letting the night flood into the church. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the shadow writhed, its shape growing more unstable with each broken pane. "You don't belong here," Claire said, her voice rising with determination. "You're tied to the darkness, to the house, and I'm not going to let you follow me anymore." The shadow screamed, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the church. It lunged at her, but its movements were sluggish, as though the light pouring in from the broken windows was sapping its strength. Claire grabbed a lighter from her pocket, one she had picked up at the gas station earlier that night, and held it to the altar cloth. The fabric caught fire instantly, the flames spreading quickly across the old, dry wood. The shadow howled in rage, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You can't escape me," it roared. "You'll never be free." But Claire didn't stop. She backed away as the flames grew, engulfing the altar and spreading to the pews. The church filled with smoke and the roar of fire, but she didn't look back. She ran out into the night, gasping for air as she stumbled onto the overgrown grass outside. Behind her, the church burned, the flames licking at the sky and casting an eerie glow over the landscape. For a moment, she stood there, watching as the fire consumed the building. She could still hear the shadows' screams, faint and distant, as though they were being pulled into some otherworldly void. And then, silence. Claire sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She didn't know if she had truly defeated the shadow or if it would find its way back to her someday. But for now, the night was still, and she was free. For now. It had been 2 weeks since the fire. Claire sat on the edge of a motel bed, the thin mattress creaking beneath her weight. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the midday sun, but the faint hum of passing cars seeped through the walls. Her hands shook as she cradled a cup of coffee, its warmth doing little to steady her nerves. The fire had made the local news, a mysterious blaze that destroyed the abandoned church. No one suspected arson. It had been written off as an accident, the result of faulty wiring in a building long forgotten. Claire had left the town the very next morning, not daring to look back. But she hadn't slept well since. Every night, she would wake up drenched in sweat, the remnants of a dream clinging to her like cobwebs. Dreams of the house. Dreams of the shadow. Dreams of herself, standing in a darkened mirror, her reflection smiling when she wasn't. She tried to convince herself that it was over, that the fire had severed whatever connection tied her to the entity. But the gnawing unease in her chest refused to fade. And then there was the mirror. She had avoided looking at her reflection for days, covering every reflective surface in the motel room with towels and blankets. But sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she would see something, a flicker of movement that didn't match her own. She couldn't keep running. She knew that. Whatever the shadow had awakened inside her, it wasn't something she could outrun. She needed answers. Claire set the coffee cup down and reached for her laptop, the glow of the screen cutting through the dimness of the room. She hesitated for a moment before typing the name of the town where it all began. Articles popped up, most of them recounting the fire or the history of the abandoned house. But one link stood out, the legend of the dark mirror, origins of a local haunting. Her heart raced as she clicked on it. The article detailed the house's grim history, a tale of betrayal, murder, and a mirror said to trap the souls of the damned. It spoke of a woman named Margaret Harrow, the original owner, who had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Margaret had been a recluse, known for her strange experiments and obsession with mirrors. When the townsfolk discovered her practices, they set her home ablaze, believing they were purging their town of evil. But Margaret had cursed them with her dying breath, swearing that her spirit would live on through her mirrors. The article ended with a chilling line. Those who gaze too long into the dark mirror may find that their reflection is no longer their own. Claire slammed the laptop shut, her pulse pounding in her ears. It all made sense now. The mirror hadn't been just a portal. It had been a prison. And when she smashed it, she hadn't destroyed the shadow. She had released it. She needed to go back. Claire packed quickly, throwing her few belongings into a duffel bag. She didn't know what she would find, but she couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the shadow to return. If Margaret Harrow had created the curse, then maybe there was a way to end it. The drive back to the town felt surreal, the landscape blurring past her as though time itself had warped. When she finally reached the outskirts, the sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over everything. The house was gone, just a blackened patch of earth where it had once stood. But Claire didn't stop there. She drove past it, toward the woods beyond. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Claire followed the winding path on foot, her breath fogging in the chilly air. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but something pulled her forward, an invisible thread drawing her deeper into the woods. Finally, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a stone circle, weathered and moss-covered, with symbols etched into its surface. At its heart was a large, cracked mirror, its surface clouded and dull. The sight of it made her stomach churn. This was it, the source. Claire approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground. The closer she got, the colder the air seemed to become. She could feel the weight of the mirror's presence, an oppressive force pressing down on her chest. She reached out to touch it, but a voice stopped her. "You've come back," it said. Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the shadow, its form more solid now, more human. It still bore her face, but there was something ancient in its eyes, something that didn't belong to her. "You can't escape me," it said, stepping closer. "You can't destroy me. I am you." Claire backed away, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't let the shadow win. Not here. Not now. The mirror pulsed, a faint glow emanating from its cracks. Claire turned toward it, an idea forming in her mind. If the mirror was the source of the curse, then maybe it could also be its end. She reached into her bag and pulled out a hammer, the one she had brought just in case. The shadow lunged at her, but she swung the hammer with all her strength, shattering the mirror into 1,000 shards. The clearing erupted in a blinding light, and Claire screamed as she was engulfed in it. And then, darkness. Claire awoke on the forest floor, her body trembling and weak. The air around her was silent, eerily so. No birds, no wind, just the sound of her own ragged breathing. She sat up slowly, her head pounding as though it had been split in two. The stone circle was gone. The clearing, once marked by ancient carvings and the ominous mirror, now looked like any other patch of forest, unremarkable and empty. Even the shards of the mirror had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. For a moment, Claire thought she might have dreamed it all, but as she reached out to steady herself against the ground, her hand brushed something cold. She looked down to see a single piece of the mirror, no larger than a coin, lying amidst the fallen leaves. Its surface was dark, reflecting nothing but an endless void. Claire's heart sank as she picked it up, holding it carefully between her fingers. The shadow was gone, but the mirror shard felt alive, pulsing faintly against her skin. It was as if the entity wasn't truly destroyed, but had instead been bound once more, its essence confined to this single fragment. Her relief was short-lived. The sound of snapping twigs broke the silence, and Claire's head whipped around. She scanned the tree line, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The forest remained still, but Claire's unease grew. She stuffed the shard into her pocket and rose to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. She had to get out of here, back to her car, back to anywhere but this place. The walk back through the woods felt interminable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch set her nerves on edge. She clutched her bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the hammer's handle for reassurance. When she finally emerged from the forest, her car was still parked where she'd left it, a welcome sight amidst the growing gloom. She climbed inside, locking the doors behind her, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. But as she started the engine and began driving away, the unease refused to leave her. The shard in her pocket felt heavier with each passing mile, a quiet reminder that her ordeal wasn't truly over. Hours later, Claire reached a new motel in a town far from the one she'd fled. She checked in, carrying her belongings into the dimly lit room. It was small and sparse, but it felt like a sanctuary after the horrors of the forest. She placed the shard on the nightstand, staring at it as she sat on the edge of the bed. The void within its surface seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as though something were stirring inside. Claire thought about throwing it away, leaving it behind, or even burying it somewhere it could never be found. But she knew that wouldn't solve anything. The curse had followed her before, and it would again. No, she had to understand it, to control it. That night, Claire dreamed of Margaret Harrow. In the dream, she stood in a grand, decaying hall lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Each one reflected a different version of herself, some younger, some older, some twisted and grotesque. At the far end of the hall stood Margaret, her figure shrouded in shadow. "You think you've won," Margaret said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "But the mirror is a doorway, not a cage. You've only delayed the inevitable. What do you want from me?" Claire demanded, her voice breaking. Margaret's smile was cold. "I want nothing. It's the mirror that wants you. It always has. And it will keep calling, no matter how far you run." Claire woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. She turned her head toward the nightstand and froze. The shard was no longer there. Instead, her reflection stared back at her from the motel's small mirror, its expression calm and serene. But as Claire leaned closer, the reflection didn't mimic her movements. It smiled. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, and the mirror splintered outward, a web of cracks spreading like lightning. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Claire stumbled backward, her breath visible in the icy air. The shadow stepped out from the broken mirror, its form more solid than ever before. "You can't destroy me," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "I am you." Claire grabbed the hammer from her bag, clutching it tightly as she faced the entity. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she refused to back down. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "You're not me. Not anymore." The shadow lunged, and Claire swung the hammer with all her strength. The blow passed through the entity, but it recoiled as though struck, its form rippling like smoke. The shard on the floor began to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter until it filled the room. Claire reached for it, the heat searing her skin as she pressed it against the shadow's chest. There was a deafening roar, and the entity let out a scream that seemed to shake the very walls. The light consumed everything, and Claire felt herself falling, weightless and untethered. When she opened her eyes, she was alone. The mirror was whole again, its surface smooth and unbroken. The shard was gone, as was the shadow. Claire stared at her reflection, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. For the first time in weeks, it was just her. She didn't know what would happen next, but as she stepped out into the morning light, she felt a tentative sense of hope. The mirror was gone. The shadow was gone. And maybe, just maybe, she could finally start to heal. Claire drove through the morning haze, her grip on the steering wheel tight as she replayed the events of the night before. She felt lighter somehow, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. Yet, a part of her remained skeptical. The shadow was gone, at least it seemed that way, but the scars it had left behind lingered. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, half expecting it to twist into that same sinister grin. But it didn't. Her face stared back at her, weary but resolute. The road stretched on, empty and quiet, as she left the motel and the cursed town behind. She didn't have a destination in mind, only the need to keep moving. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a soft hum of static. Claire reached to turn it off, but a voice emerged from the distortion, faint, almost imperceptible. "Claire." Her hand froze. The voice was familiar, but warped, as though spoken through water. Her chest tightened as she turned the radio dial, trying to find a clear signal. Claire, you can't ignore me forever. Her pulse quickened. The voice was hers. Stop it, she muttered, twisting the knob again. But the voice only grew louder, more insistent. You thought it was over. You thought you won. But you're wrong. You'll always be wrong. The car swerved as Claire's grip on the wheel faltered. She pulled over to the side of the road, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. This isn't real, she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. When she opened them again, the voice was gone, replaced by the soft hiss of static. She turned off the radio, her hands trembling. It was nothing, just her imagination, a trick of her exhausted mind. But the doubt lingered. Hours passed as she drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to dense forests. She found herself on a narrow, winding road, the kind that seemed to go on forever without a clear end. The trees loomed over her, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. As the sky darkened, she realized she needed to find a place to stay for the night. Her phone had no signal, and the GPS had long since stopped working. The road eventually led her to a small, isolated inn nestled at the edge of the forest. It was old, its wooden exterior weathered by time, but it had a warm glow emanating from its windows. Claire hesitated before stepping out of the car, her instincts screaming at her to keep driving. But exhaustion won out. Inside, the inn was quaint, almost cozy. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of pine filled the air. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, greeted her warmly. "Just passing through?" the woman asked as she handed Claire a key. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just for the night." The room was small but comfortable, with a single bed and a window that overlooked the forest. Claire set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the trees. Something about this place felt off. The inn was too quiet, too still, as though it were holding its breath. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She was just paranoid, still on edge from everything that had happened. But as the night deepened, the sense of unease grew. Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello." The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the mirror above the dresser. Claire's blood ran cold as she approached it, her reflection barely visible in the dim light. The whispers swirled around her, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each one speaking her name. And then the reflection changed. It wasn't her face anymore. It was Margaret Harrow. "You can't escape," the reflection said, its lips curling into a cruel smile. "The mirror doesn't let go." Claire stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for the hammer in her bag. But before she could grab it, the glass shattered, and a shadowy figure emerged from the mirror, its form writhing and twisting. "No!" Claire screamed, swinging the hammer at the shadow. The figure recoiled, its edges flickering like a dying flame. But it didn't disappear. The room filled with a deafening roar as the shadow lunged at her, its cold, inky tendrils wrapping around her arms and legs. Claire struggled, her screams muffled by the weight of the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadow dissipated, retreating back into the shards of the broken mirror. Claire collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Her body ached, and her vision blurred, but she forced herself to her feet. She grabbed the shards of glass, throwing them into a pillowcase and tying it shut. She couldn't let this happen again. With a makeshift sack in hand, she fled the inn, not bothering to explain herself to the bewildered innkeeper. She drove to the nearest body of water she could find, a deep, murky lake shrouded in mist. Without hesitation, she hurled the sack into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. Claire stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting at her skin. It was over. It had to be. But as she turned to leave, the faintest ripple broke the stillness of the lake, and from the depths a whisper rose. Claire. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat as the whisper drifted through the air. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the wind across the water, but it carried her name with an unnatural clarity. She turned back toward the lake, her heart pounding. The surface was calm again, the ripples gone as though they had never existed. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, clenching her fists. "It's over. It's done." But even as she said the words, the nagging doubt in her mind refused to be silenced. The faint whisper came again, rising from the water like a ghostly echo. This time, it wasn't alone. Other voices joined it, blending together in a haunting symphony of murmurs and cries. "Claire, why did you leave us?" Her legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground. The voice wasn't hers or Margaret's. It was something else, something older and more desperate. The lake seemed to shimmer in the pale moonlight, and Claire took an involuntary step back. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though pleading for her attention. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice trembling. "I've done everything you wanted. Just leave me alone." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing and the rustling of the trees. And then, from the lake's center, something began to rise. It started as a dark shape beneath the surface, barely visible against the murky water. Slowly, it emerged, a black, glistening mass that twisted and undulated as though it were alive. Claire stumbled backward, her eyes widening in horror. The shape grew taller, its edges rippling like liquid smoke. As it took form, faint glimmers of light shimmered within it, like stars trapped in an abyss. A voice echoed from the mass, low and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You thought you could bury us," it said, the words reverberating in Claire's chest. "You cannot destroy what was never alive to begin with." The entity began to move toward her, gliding across the surface of the water as though gravity held no sway over it. Claire turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she sprinted toward her car. The forest seemed darker now, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at her as she passed. She didn't dare look back. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. They filled her head, drowning out her thoughts, until they were all she could hear. "Don't run," they said in unison, their tone almost mocking. "You belong to us now." Claire burst into the clearing where her car was parked, her fingers fumbling with the keys as she yanked open the door. She threw herself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. She sat there, gripping the steering wheel, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Then the car's engine sputtered to life, and she peeled out of the clearing, the tires kicking up dirt and leaves as she sped down the narrow road. The forest closed in around her, the shadows pressing against the windows like a living thing. The whispers began again, faint but insistent, seeping into the car like a creeping fog. "Don't you see, Claire? You'll never escape. The mirror is a part of you now." She shook her head, gripping the wheel tighter. "No," she said through clenched teeth. "You're lying. You're nothing but a parasite." The rearview mirror darkened, the glass filling with swirling shadows. Claire's reflection appeared, her face twisted into a cruel smile. "Is that what you think?" the reflection said, its voice dripping with malice. "You should know better by now." The shadows began to spill out of the mirror, pooling in the back seat like a rising tide. Claire slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car careening down the winding road. The headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the trees seemed to close in around her. She could feel the shadow reaching for her, its icy tendrils brushing against her neck. "No!" she screamed, swerving sharply to avoid a fallen tree. The car skidded to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying. The shadow enveloped the car, the whispers turning into a deafening roar. Claire grabbed the hammer from the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she held it tightly. "If you want me," she said, her voice shaking but defiant, "then come and get me." The shadow lunged, and Claire swung the hammer with all her strength. The blow struck something solid, and the shadow recoiled, its form rippling violently. The rear-view mirror shattered, and the shadow let out an ear-splitting scream. Claire threw open the car door and stumbled out, running blindly into the forest. The whispers followed her, but they were weaker now, their voices fractured and disjointed. She didn't stop until she reached a clearing, collapsing to her knees as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The whispers were gone. The shadow was gone. But Claire knew better than to believe it was truly over. Somewhere, the mirror still existed, its pieces scattered but not destroyed. And as long as even one shard remained, the darkness would never be far behind. Claire remained in the clearing, the faint light of dawn filtering through the canopy above. Her chest heaved, her breath ragged as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The terror, the relentless whispers, the shadow that had haunted her every step. It was like a nightmare that refused to end. She wiped the dirt and sweat from her face, her eyes scanning the quiet forest around her. Everything was still now, eerily so. The air had shifted. The tension that had gripped her all night was slowly dissipating, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. But even in the calm, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen, was still watching her. Claire stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her as if the terror had drained her strength. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, hoping, praying that the signal would be back. It wasn't. The screen flickered with a message. No service. Of course. She could already feel the isolation creeping in again. The thought of being truly alone in this vast, dark forest, cut off from the world, made her stomach churn. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run back to civilization. But something else tugged at her, a deeper, more primal feeling that told her there was unfinished business here. With a deep breath, Claire turned and began walking through the trees, her pace slow at first, as if each step felt like an eternity. The whispers seemed distant now, but she knew they were never far. Hours passed before she stumbled upon a narrow path, its edges overgrown with moss and vines. She followed it, her steps heavy, until the trees began to thin out, revealing a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old weathered stone well, its surface chipped and cracked with age. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. It was the same well from the vision she had seen before, the one she had dreamed about the night she first encountered the shadow. She approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving the well. The air around her felt thicker here, the weight of history pressing down upon her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. As she reached the edge of the well, she looked down into the darkness below. It was deep, impossibly so, the blackness swallowing everything in its depths. Claire felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force urging her to peer deeper, to throw herself in. But she resisted. She had come too far to let herself be consumed again. Instead, she turned and backed away from the well, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The whispers, soft and insidious, began to rise once more, curling around her like a fog. "You can't escape, Claire. You're one of us now." The voice was unmistakable. It was Margaret's. Claire shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "No, I'm not. I'm not like you." The wind picked up, swirling around her as the whispers grew louder, more distorted. It was as if the very air itself was alive, pressing in from all sides. A sudden crash of thunder ripped through the sky, and in the blink of an eye, the shadows returned. They surged from the edges of the clearing, rising like a tidal wave, engulfing the trees, the ground, and everything in its path. Claire screamed and turned to run, but the shadows were already upon her. They snaked around her legs, dragging her back toward the well, toward the abyss. With a desperate cry, she reached out, her fingers grazing the nearest tree, but it was no use. The shadows wrapped around her arms and neck, pulling her closer to the edge. She kicked and struggled, her body fighting against the dark tendrils that seemed to have no end. But the more she fought, the tighter they became, suffocating her, drowning her in darkness. A sudden vision flashed in her mind, the mirror shattered, reflecting her own twisted face. She could see Margaret's twisted grin, watching her from the depths of the mirror, waiting for her to succumb. "Stop!" Claire screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. She could feel herself being dragged toward the well's edge, the shadows closing in on her like a hungry moth. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, desperately trying to anchor herself, but the shadows were relentless, pulling her ever closer. Then, just as she was about to be consumed, a sharp, crackling noise split the air. The shadows recoiled. A figure stepped out from the trees, its form shimmering in the fading light. Claire's heart skipped as she recognized the silhouette. It was the old innkeeper, the same woman who had greeted her at the inn all those days ago. Her face was calm, almost serene, her hands outstretched toward Claire. "You," Claire whispered, her breath ragged. "How?" The woman's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I've been waiting for you, Claire," she said softly, her voice echoing in the stillness. "We all have." Claire's heart raced, and she instinctively recoiled, but the woman stepped closer, her presence somehow soothing despite the chaos around them. "You're not the first," the innkeeper continued, her voice carrying a strange, ethereal weight. "And you won't be the last. The shadow is bound to this place, to this land. But it's not the only thing that calls to those who wander too close." The shadows that had once been choking Claire now shrank back, retreating into the forest like frightened animals. The figure of the innkeeper seemed to hold a power over them, a power that Claire couldn't understand. "I can help you," the innkeeper said, reaching out to gently touch Claire's trembling arm. "But you must trust me." Claire nodded weakly, still unsure of what to make of the woman and her strange presence. But the alternative, the abyss, the endless shadows, was far worse. "Trust me," the innkeeper repeated, her voice a soft whisper in Claire's ear. "You don't have to face this alone." And with that, the world around Claire seemed to shift. The shadows faded, the whispers quieted, and the weight of the terror that had followed her all this time finally began to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire took a deep breath, feeling the first real sense of peace she had known in so long. But as the innkeeper's smile grew wider, Claire could not shake the feeling that the story was far from over. It had only just begun. Claire stood there, staring at the innkeeper, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet still alert to the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. The woman's presence was calm, almost soothing, yet something about her seemed wrong, out of place. The very tranquility she exuded felt unnatural in such a cursed place. "You've made it this far," the innkeeper said, her voice soft yet undeniably firm. "But now the real journey begins." Claire frowned, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean?" "I've seen what this place can do. It's all I can take. I don't want any more part of it. Let me go home." The innkeeper shook her head gently. "There is no home for you, Claire. Not anymore." A shiver ran down Claire's spine at the finality in the woman's words. She opened her mouth to protest, but the innkeeper raised her hand, silencing her. "You've been marked," she explained. "By the shadow, by the whispers, by everything that lies within this land. They have taken a piece of you, and they won't let you go so easily. You can try to run, but it will always be there, pulling you back." Claire's mind spun. The shadow, the well, the whispers. It was all a part of some dark, twisted web that she couldn't escape. "I thought I was free. I thought it was over." The innkeeper smiled sadly. "That's what they want you to believe. But the truth is, it will never be over until it's finished. And that is not something you can run from. You are a part of it now." Claire's pulse quickened. The weight of those words sank into her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She wanted to run, to flee as far as possible from this cursed place, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line, and whatever had been awakened within her would follow. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Claire whispered, her voice cracking with fear. The innkeeper stepped closer, her expression soft but distant, as though she were gazing beyond Claire into something that wasn't there. "You must face it. The darkness, the shadow, the mirror. It's all a part of the same force. You must go back to the well, back to where it all began." Claire recoiled at the mention of the well, the memories of the shadow and its grasp still fresh in her mind. Back there. She shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, I can't. I won't." The innkeeper's gaze hardened for the first time. "You have no choice. You must confront what's within you. Only then will you find peace. Only then can you break the cycle." Claire felt a deep, cold dread coil in her stomach. The cycle. It was a word that echoed through her mind, a warning she couldn't quite understand. But she knew that this was no ordinary nightmare. This was something far older, more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. "I don't understand," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. The innkeeper's expression softened once more, but her words were firm. You will. When you return to the well, you will see it for what it truly is. The shadow isn't just a force of darkness. It is a manifestation of fear, of all the things you have run from, hidden from. It thrives on the lies you tell yourself, the guilt you carry. But when you face it, you can make it disappear. Claire's heart raced, a storm of conflicting emotions swirling inside her. Part of her screamed to flee, to run from this madness and never look back. But another part, the part that had been haunted by the shadow, knew she couldn't ignore the truth forever. What if it's too much? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The innkeeper's lips curled into a faint smile. Then you'll be just like the others. But if you are strong enough, if you truly confront your fears and embrace the truth, you will break the cycle. You will be free. There was a long pause. Claire felt the weight of the woman's words pressing against her chest. She didn't know if she was strong enough for what lay ahead, but she also knew she could no longer hide. The shadow had already taken too much from her. She had to face it head-on. With a deep breath, Claire nodded. I'll go back, she said, her voice steadying despite the fear that still clung to her every word. The innkeeper nodded approvingly. Good. But be warned, what lies at the bottom of the well is not what you expect. The truth can be far more terrifying than the darkness itself. Claire turned, her resolve hardening with each step. She walked toward the clearing where the well stood, the earth beneath her feet cold and unfamiliar. Every part of her screamed to turn around, but she pushed forward, knowing that her only choice was to face what had been haunting her. As she neared the edge of the well, the air grew heavy once more, the whispers returning, faint at first, then growing louder. They circled around her, calling her name in distorted tones. But this time, Claire didn't flinch. She stood tall, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The well before her seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it were alive, waiting for her to make the final choice. She gazed into its depths, the blackness swirling like an endless void. But something inside her stirred, a flicker of recognition, a fragment of truth she hadn't known before. She wasn't just facing the shadow, she was confronting her own demons. The fear, the guilt, the regrets that had haunted her for so long. They were all here, in the depths of the well, and they were waiting for her to take the plunge. With a final, steady breath, Claire closed her eyes and stepped forward. The ground beneath her trembled. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the world around her seemed to collapse into darkness. And then, the well consumed her whole. Claire fell, faster than she could comprehend. The darkness swallowed her, and for a moment, she felt nothing. No ground beneath her feet, no air in her lungs, only a cold, empty void. The air around her seemed to hum, vibrating with a deep, otherworldly resonance, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. She couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. The sensation of falling was infinite, and with each passing moment, the weight of her decision bore down on her chest. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her, but she couldn't stop herself. She had already chosen. The ground, if it could even be called that, finally appeared below her, but it was unlike anything she had seen before. The earth was cracked and shattered, as though something ancient and powerful had torn it apart. Jagged rocks protruded from the blackened soil, and the air was thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. As Claire landed, she stumbled and fell to her knees, the impact taking her breath away. She gasped, looking up to find herself in a vast, cavernous space. It was the inside of the well, though it seemed far larger than any well should be. There were no walls, no structure, just an endless expanse of inky darkness stretching in all directions. The air was heavy, damp with the smell of decay and rot. The silence, unnerving and profound, filled every corner of the space. Claire stood up, her legs trembling from the fall, and looked around. There were no visible exits, no way out, just the suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers that had been haunting her grew louder, swirling around her, filling her head with their maddening chorus. But this time, there was something different, something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have come," a voice said, soft but unmistakable. It was Margaret's voice, the same one Claire had heard in the forest, in the inn, in her dreams. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had to face whatever was here, whatever had been lurking in the shadows all this time, but she wasn't sure she was prepared. I have to face it," she whispered to herself, more out of a need for reassurance than belief. The ground trembled beneath her, and Claire's eyes widened as something moved in the darkness. The shadows began to coalesce into a shape, something tall and thin, its outline indistinct, but its presence undeniable. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices rising, but Claire could pick out one voice over the others. "You're too late," it hissed, a chilling sound that sent a cold shiver down Claire's spine. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting as it moved, flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. It wasn't human. There was no way to tell what it was. It was an amalgamation of shadows, of twisted shapes, a being born from the fear and guilt that Claire had carried for so long. And yet, it was more. It was everything. Claire instinctively stepped back, but the thing moved toward her, its presence overwhelming. She could feel the air grow colder, the shadows tightening around her, trying to drag her into their depths. The whispers spoke faster now, like a chant, and the figure's form solidified into something even more terrifying, the shadow of herself. It was her, distorted, twisted, but unmistakably Claire. Her eyes were empty, hollow, her features twisted into an expression of hatred and despair. Her own reflection, her fear, her guilt, was standing before her. "You think you can escape me?" The shadow of Claire sneered, its voice mocking. "You've always known you were broken. It's why you came here. To face the truth you've been running from." Claire's stomach churned as she stared at the figure. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't me. You're not real." But the shadow only laughed, a cruel hollow sound that reverberated in the cavernous space. "You can't lie to yourself anymore. We are one, Claire. We always have been." Claire's heart pounded as the shadow moved closer, its presence suffocating, its eyes locked onto hers. The guilt, the fear, the darkness she had been carrying inside her, this was the manifestation of it all. It was her own mind, her own pain made real. "No," Claire repeated, her voice growing stronger despite the terror that gripped her. "I won't let you control me." The shadow smiled, a twisted, cruel smile. "You think you can fight me? You think you can outrun your own demons?" The whispers grew louder, the darkness tightening around Claire like a vice. But Claire didn't back down. She had come too far, had faced too many horrors to let herself be consumed by this twisted reflection of herself. She closed her eyes for a moment, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. The innkeeper's words echoed in her mind. Only then can you break the cycle. Claire realized the truth of them now. This wasn't just a battle against the shadow. It was a battle against herself, against the lies and fears she had carried for so long. With a determined breath, Claire opened her eyes and stared directly at her shadow self. "You don't control me," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You're just a part of me, but I'm stronger than you." For a moment, the shadow faltered, its twisted grin faltering as it seemed to recoil. The whispers slowed, their hold loosening. Claire took another step forward, her fear still there, but her resolve even stronger. The shadow snarled, its form flickering as if it were made of smoke. "You cannot win. You cannot escape." But Claire didn't flinch. She had come to realize something in that moment. Her fear, her guilt, her past mistakes, they no longer had the power to control her. They were a part of her, but they didn't define her. With a final, resolute breath, Claire took another step toward the shadow, her heart pounding but steady. "I'm not afraid anymore." The shadow let out a deafening screech, a sound so piercing it felt like it was tearing the very fabric of reality apart. The cavern shook violently, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. But Claire stood firm, her eyes locked onto her own twisted reflection, and in that instant, the darkness began to unravel. The shadow screamed, its form dissipating into the air, dissolving into the very darkness it had come from. The whispers faltered, the weight of the terror that had haunted Claire for so long lifting. And then, silence. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire felt an overwhelming peace wash over her. The weight that had burdened her for so long was gone, the darkness fading into nothingness. She had broken free. She looked around, finding herself back in the clearing, the well no longer looming before her. The sun was rising, its light breaking through the trees, casting a warm glow over the forest. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill her lungs. She was free, and this time she knew she wouldn't be haunted by the shadows again. But as she turned to leave, a lingering thought crossed her mind, a thought that unsettled her, a thought that she couldn't shake. What if the shadows weren't truly gone? What if they had only just begun to watch her from the darkness once more? The answer, Claire realized, would come in time. But for now, she could finally rest. And with that, she walked away, leaving the darkness behind. As Claire walked through the forest, the morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm and welcoming glow on the path ahead. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of pine and earth. It seemed as though the world had been reborn. The horrors of the night faded into the past. But deep within, Claire knew that she could never be certain. The journey to face her fears had left its mark. The past she had tried so hard to outrun was no longer hidden in the shadows, and although she had conquered the darkness that had chased her for so long, a nagging question lingered. Had she truly defeated it? Or was it merely waiting, lurking in the silence, biding its time for the perfect moment to return? The deeper Claire walked into the forest, the more she felt a sense of unease growing. Her footsteps, once sure and steady, became hesitant. Her surroundings, so familiar, so comforting, now seemed distorted, as though the world was subtly shifting beneath her feet. She glanced over her shoulder, and for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw something move in the distance, a dark shape flickering at the edge of her vision. But when she turned her head completely, there was nothing there, only the quiet, gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. Still, the feeling of being watched remained, an eerie sensation that clung to her like a second skin. "Get a grip, Claire," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her thoughts. "There's nothing here. You're free." But the doubts gnawed at her, relentless. She had confronted the shadow of herself in the well, faced the fear and guilt that had consumed her for so long, but had she truly left it behind? Was she still running from it? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she walked deeper into the woods. The sun, though still shining brightly, seemed to fade slightly, as if a cloud had passed across it, dimming the warmth of the light. The trees loomed higher now, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching down to grab her. The sound of birdsong, so soothing moments ago, now felt strangely distant, muffled. It was as if the forest itself had grown quieter, holding its breath in anticipation. Then, just as Claire was about to dismiss the creeping unease, she heard it. A faint whisper, soft and indistinct, just beyond the reach of her hearing. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or perhaps her imagination. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and hushed, too familiar to ignore. "You cannot escape." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in the well, the same voice that had haunted her dreams and whispered in the darkness. The voice of the shadow, the voice of her fear. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, eyes wide, searching frantically for any sign of movement. But once again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, the silence. She took a step back, her pulse quickening. "No," she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. "You're gone. I faced you. I'm free." But the voice didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, as if the very forest itself had begun to speak to her. "You can't outrun me. I am you. I will always be a part of you." Claire's breath caught in her throat, panic rising in her chest. She didn't know where the voice was coming from, but she could feel it. The weight of it pressed down on her, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe. Her mind raced, every logical thought slipping away as the darkness of her own mind began to consume her once again. She had escaped the well, but could she escape herself? The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. They surrounded her, pushing in from all sides, drowning out the world. "Stop," Claire whispered, clutching her head as if trying to shut out the sound. "Please, leave me alone." But the voice continued, undeterred. "You are not free, Claire. You have never been free. You've always been trapped by your own thoughts, your own guilt, your own darkness. You can never escape that." The forest seemed to close in on her, the trees pressing in, their branches twisting like tendrils trying to ensnare her. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting with each step she took, as though it were moving beneath her in rhythm with the whispers. Claire stumbled backward, her legs weak, and before she realized what was happening, the ground beneath her crumbled away. She fell once more, but this time there was no end. No well to catch her, no solid ground to land on. The darkness stretched endlessly, a void that consumed her whole. The whispers followed her, louder now, relentless. There is no escape. There is no way out. Claire's mind raced as she fell through the darkness. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, but now, here in the void, she felt it all closing in once again. The fear, the guilt, the pain, it was all coming back. She had thought she was free, but perhaps the darkness was not something she could escape. Perhaps it was part of her, a shadow that would always be by her side, no matter how far she ran. As she fell deeper, the whispers turned into laughter. Low, mocking, cruel. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't the shadow's voice. It was something else, something far more ancient, far more terrible. You are mine, Claire. You have always been mine. And you always will be. The laughter echoed around her, a cruel reminder that some things could never be outrun. The darkness, the shadows, they would always find their way back. And with that final thought, the void closed in on her, swallowing her whole. As the darkness swallowed Claire, she felt a profound stillness take over. The laughter faded, replaced by a silence so complete that it pressed in on her, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. There was no sound, no movement, no light, only an unyielding, all-consuming void. Her mind raced, and for a moment, she wondered if she had truly fallen into the abyss, or if this was just another manifestation of her own fears. Could she wake up from this? Could she escape? Or was this the end, the final chapter of her story? And then, in the suffocating silence, she felt a sensation. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, like a tremor beneath her feet, a shift in the very fabric of the void. It was almost as if the darkness itself was alive. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping in a way that felt unnatural. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around her body for warmth. A whisper broke the silence, so quiet that it was barely more than a breath against her ear. You think you can run away? You think you can hide from me? It was the same voice, but this time it was different, deeper, more menacing. It vibrated through her bones, an icy touch that made her skin crawl. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound reverberating in the stillness. No, Claire whispered, her voice hoarse. I'm not afraid of you. But deep inside, she knew that the voice was right. The fear, the guilt, the darkness, it was all part of her. She couldn't escape it. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, as if it were alive, feeding off her fear. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing against her, holding her in place. And then, suddenly, a flicker of light pierced the void. It was faint at first, a small spark that seemed insignificant in the overwhelming darkness. But Claire clung to it, desperate for some sign of hope. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and the light grew brighter, illuminating the space around her. It was a door, an ancient, weathered door, standing alone in the middle of the void. The wood was cracked and splintered, the paint chipped away by time, but there was no mistaking it. It was a door that led somewhere. A sense of urgency washed over Claire. The darkness around her was closing in, the whispers growing louder, the air colder. She had to move. She had to reach that door before the darkness consumed her entirely. She pushed forward, her legs unsteady, her breath ragged. Every step felt like it was taking her further away from the safety of the light, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. With one final burst of strength, Claire reached the door. Her fingers brushed against the cool, rough wood, and for the briefest of moments, the whispers quieted. The darkness seemed to recede, if only for a heartbeat. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What lay beyond it? Could it lead her to freedom? Or was it just another trap, another part of the darkness trying to trick her into letting her guard down? The voice spoke again, this time closer, almost in her ear. "You are mine, Claire. There is no escape. There's nothing beyond this door. You can't outrun me." But Claire didn't listen. She didn't have time for doubt. With a shaking hand, she turned the doorknob and stepped through the door. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, complete and absolute. She felt herself falling once more, but this time there was no sense of terror, no panic. It was as if she were floating, suspended in time and space. And then, suddenly, the world snapped back into focus. She was standing in a familiar place, a place she hadn't seen in years. The old, abandoned house where she had spent her childhood, the place she had tried to forget. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the air was thick with dust and decay. But as she stood there, the overwhelming sense of dread was gone. The darkness, the whispers, the fear, they were all gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt a strange sense of peace. She took a deep breath, her pulse slowing, and looked around. The house was empty, but it felt different now, like a place she had returned to after a long, exhausting journey. It wasn't the place of her nightmares anymore. Claire walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She moved past the old furniture, the remnants of a life that once was. But there was no fear, no lurking darkness, only stillness. At last, she reached the room where it had all started, the room with the well, the place where her greatest fears had taken root, where the darkness had first consumed her. The well was still there, its stone edges weathered by time, the water within it dark and still. But as Claire gazed down into its depths, she no longer felt the pull of fear. The well was no longer a place of terror. It was just a well, an old, forgotten part of her past. She stepped back, a smile tugging at her lips. It was over. The darkness had been conquered, and for the first time, Claire felt free. Free from the guilt, the fear, the shadow that had haunted her for so long. With one last glance at the well, she turned and walked out of the house. The door closed behind her, and as she stepped into the sunlight, she knew that she was no longer running. She had faced her fears and emerged stronger, ready to live the life she had been hiding from. The darkness was gone, and with it, the last vestiges of her past. It was time to move on. As Claire stepped into the sunlight, the warmth of the day wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. The world felt new, alive with possibilities she had long since abandoned. But even as the brightness of the sky above seemed to fill her with a newfound sense of peace, something deep within her remained unsettled. It was a subtle feeling, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, too faint to fully understand, but impossible to ignore. She glanced back at the house, now standing silent and still behind her. For a moment, she wondered if it had ever truly been a part of her, or if it had just been a manifestation of everything she had tried to forget. Either way, it was in the past, and the future lay before her, untouched, waiting for her to embrace it. But as she walked further from the house, the sense of peace that had once enveloped her began to waver. The air felt thick, as though it had changed, growing heavier with each step she took. The sunlight, once golden and welcoming, now seemed to dim, as though a cloud had passed over it, casting an ominous shadow across the landscape. Claire paused, a shiver creeping down her spine. It was a fleeting sensation, one she couldn't quite grasp, but it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She looked around, her heart rate quickening slightly as she tried to shake the unease. The world still seemed normal, still bright and open, but now there was something off about it, something she couldn't put her finger on. She continued walking, trying to push the feeling aside, but it clung to her like a cold breath on her neck. It was then that she heard it, the faintest rustling in the trees behind her. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing moment. She turned around, her pulse quickening, and there in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees, she saw a figure. A shadow, dark and formless, moving slowly toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure grew closer, its form becoming more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence seemed to distort the air around it. It didn't walk like a person, but rather it seemed to glide, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it wasn't entirely part of this world. The darkness of the figure seemed to devour the light, leaving only a void in its wake. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure that was drawing nearer with every passing second. "You can't run from me, Claire." The voice, low, guttural, and all too familiar, echoed through her mind. It was the same voice that had tormented her in the well, the same voice that had haunted her dreams. But now it felt different, more malevolent, as if the very air around her was alive with its power. Claire took another step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This couldn't be happening. She had faced her fears. She had confronted the darkness in the well, and yet here it was again, standing before her, more terrifying than ever. "I am always with you, Claire. You can never escape me." Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Was this just another trick of her mind? A hallucination, a remnant of the terror she had once experienced? Or was this something real? Something far darker, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined? The figure continued to glide closer, its presence suffocating, like a storm cloud darkening the sky. Claire's pulse raced, her limbs frozen in place. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening with every passing second. "You thought you could run. You thought you could hide." The voice whispered again, its tone mocking. "But I have always been here, watching, waiting." Claire's heart slammed against her ribcage as a surge of fear coursed through her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure was now just a few feet away, and Claire could feel the chill emanating from it, an unnatural cold that seeped into her skin and made her bones ache. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. And then, just as the darkness seemed to close in around her, she saw it, the faintest flicker of light. A small, distant spark, like a candle burning in the distance. It was a beacon, a reminder of the safety she had once known, a symbol of hope that had not yet been extinguished. With every ounce of strength left in her, Claire forced her legs to move, stumbling forward, her body heavy, but driven by an instinct she couldn't suppress. She had faced the darkness before. She had stared into its depths and emerged stronger. She couldn't let it consume her now. She pushed forward, step by trembling step, toward the light. But the figure followed, its presence relentless, a shadow that stretched out across the ground like a tidal wave, chasing her every move. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought against the terror threatening to engulf her. And then, as she reached the edge of the trees, she saw it. The well. The place where everything had begun, where the darkness had first taken hold. It stood there, silent and waiting, as though it had been calling her back all along. The figure halted, standing at the edge of the forest, its presence a looming threat in the distance. It didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Claire knew that it was always there, just out of reach, watching, waiting. She glanced down at the well, the familiar chill creeping back into her bones as she remembered the terror it had once brought her. But now, standing before it once more, she didn't feel fear. She felt determination. The darkness could come, it could follow her, but she would not be consumed again. With a deep breath, Claire stepped toward the well, her mind resolute. This time, she would face it once and for all. This time, she would win. Claire stood at the edge of the well, her breath heavy in her chest as she stared down into the darkness below. The familiar fear clawed at her insides, but it was different this time. It wasn't the same paralyzing terror that had once held her captive. No, this time, she felt the sting of defiance. A fire she hadn't known she still had within her. The well had been a symbol of her fears for so long, a place where the shadows had whispered and the darkness had nearly swallowed her whole. But now, standing before it, she realized it wasn't the well that was the problem. It wasn't the shadows or the voices. It was the part of herself she had been running from, the fear that had taken root deep within her, feeding off every moment of doubt and hesitation. The figure that had pursued her, its dark, shapeless form lingering just beyond the trees, wasn't just an external force. It was a reflection of her own fears, her own insecurities, and her inability to confront the past. She had been running, trying to escape, but the only way to truly escape was to face what lay within. "You can't escape me, Claire." The voice echoed once more, colder this time, like the wind that whistled through the trees. But Claire didn't flinch. She didn't back away. "I've been trying to run for so long," she whispered to herself, her words barely audible in the stillness of the night. "But I can't run anymore. I have to face this." She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving with purpose. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth was resisting her. The well before her loomed, a deep abyss that seemed to swallow the moonlight, casting its own shadow on the land around her. But the closer she got, the more the fear began to dissipate, replaced by something stronger, something more powerful. The darkness, the fear, the voice, it was all a lie. A story she had been telling herself, a narrative she had allowed to control her life. But it was time to rewrite that story. With one final deep breath, Claire reached down and grabbed the old, weathered rope that dangled from the edge of the well. It was cold to the touch, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled it taut, the sound of the rope scraping against the stone walls of the well echoing in the silence. The darkness below seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, waiting for her to fall into its depths. But Claire didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. With a strength she didn't know she had, she swung the rope over the edge of the well, letting it drop into the dark chasm below. And as the rope disappeared into the void, something inside her shifted. The world around her seemed to quiet, the whispers fading into nothingness. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of everything she had been carrying slowly lift from her shoulders. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it was all gone. It wasn't that the darkness had disappeared. It was that she had learned to stand against it. To face it, not with terror, but with the resolve to overcome. She glanced up at the sky, the first rays of dawn breaking through the horizon, casting a soft light over the land. The shadows were receding, the world coming back to life with every passing second. And then, just as she turned to leave, the figure appeared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a shadow, a nightmare, or a manifestation of her fears. It was simply a man, a figure that resembled someone she once knew, someone she had once loved. Her heart clenched in her chest, and for the briefest moment, she felt a wave of sadness, of longing. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. Instead, she smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "It's time to go," she said quietly, more to herself than to the figure. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching her, as if understanding that her journey had come to an end. With a final glance at the figure, Claire turned and walked away, the sun now fully risen, casting its golden light over everything in its path. The world was a place of new beginnings, of hope, of light. And this time, Claire was ready to embrace it all. The darkness was no longer something to fear. It was simply a part of the story, a chapter that had been written, and now it was time for a new one. As she walked away from the well, the figure slowly faded into the background, becoming nothing more than a shadow in her memory. Claire knew that no matter where she went from here, she would never be the same. She had faced the darkness, and in doing so, she had learned to live with the light. And for the first time in a long while, she felt free. As Claire continued walking away from the well, she could still feel the weight of her past behind her, lingering like a faint shadow. But with each step she took, that weight seemed to grow lighter, less oppressive. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warmth over the land, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt as though she was walking toward something new, a future she could finally embrace. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of twists and turns she couldn't predict, but there was a sense of calm within her that she hadn't known before. The horrors of the past, the terrifying figure that had haunted her thoughts and dreams, now seemed distant and unreal, as though they had never truly existed beyond the walls of her own mind. She glanced behind her one last time, almost expecting the darkness to return, the shadows to stretch once more toward her. But there was nothing, only the peaceful, quiet landscape, bathed in the soft light of the early morning. It was almost as if the world had been reborn, just as she had. The fear that had once gripped her heart no longer had a hold. The nightmarish visions that had once seemed inescapable had faded into the background, and in their place, Claire felt a profound sense of clarity. It wasn't the kind of clarity that erased all uncertainty or banished every lingering doubt. It was the kind that came from understanding, from knowing that she had faced what terrified her most and had emerged stronger, more whole. But as she walked further into the unknown, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Not with malice, but with the kind of knowing presence that was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. She couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but it wasn't a fear she felt. It was more like a quiet awareness, as if the universe itself was quietly acknowledging her strength. She soon found herself standing at the edge of a small village, its rustic buildings nestled between rolling hills. The smell of fresh bread and coffee wafted through the air, a sharp contrast to the dread she had once known. The peaceful hum of everyday life filled the streets, the sounds of people going about their day, oblivious to the turmoil Claire had left behind. But she didn't mind. This was the world she was meant to be a part of, the world she had forgotten in her attempts to escape the past. As she walked into the village, she felt the eyes of the townspeople on her, but instead of fear or judgment, she felt something else: acceptance. There was no need to explain, no need to justify her journey. It had led her here to this moment, and that was enough. Claire continued to walk, her steps lighter now, as though the very earth beneath her feet was carrying her forward. She passed by the familiar faces of the villagers, offering them a quiet smile, and they smiled back, some with curiosity, some with kindness, but all with the unspoken understanding that she was just another soul passing through, just another person trying to find their place in this world. And as she made her way through the village, she knew deep down that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Because no matter how much she had faced, how much darkness she had confronted, there would always be new challenges, new fears to overcome. But now, she knew she had the strength to face them, and that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all. As Claire continued her walk, the distant sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of the trees around her created a symphony of peace that wrapped around her like a blanket. The world was calm, unhurried, and for the first time in a long while, she felt as though she belonged. The sun was high in the sky now, shining brightly as the village ahead seemed to beckon her forward. And for the first time, Claire walked toward it without looking back. No fear, no doubt, no lingering shadow. She had embraced the light, and it had embraced her in return. The road ahead may not always be easy, and there may be times when the shadows try to creep back in. But Claire was no longer afraid, for she knew that the greatest darkness of all had already been faced and conquered, and now she was free. With each step, she moved further into the future she had once feared, and with each step, the past seemed to fade into the distance, becoming nothing more than a whisper in the wind. As Claire walked deeper into the village, the streets grew busier. People bustled about, exchanging pleasantries, laughing, and going about their daily routines. The atmosphere felt ordinary, peaceful, and alive, everything Claire had longed for during the years of uncertainty and terror. Yet, despite the outward calm, something still lingered in the corners of her mind, a small knot of unease she couldn't quite untangle. She stopped for a moment to observe the village square. The town was quaint, with cobbled streets and charming houses adorned with flower boxes. In the center of the square was a fountain, its water trickling softly, creating a soothing melody that seemed to merge with the hum of the world around her. There were families gathered, children playing, and shopkeepers standing outside their stores, offering goods to passers-by. But as Claire stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly off. It wasn't the people or the surroundings. No, it was something deeper, a sensation that gripped her heart with a quiet dread, as if an invisible thread was connecting her to something she couldn't see. She glanced over her shoulder instinctively, half expecting to find the figure from the well or the shadows that had haunted her before. But there was nothing, just the serene, everyday life of the village unfolding in front of her. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the lingering unease, but it wouldn't go away. The feeling wasn't of being watched, but of being pulled, as though something unseen was drawing her toward a particular place, a destination she couldn't identify. Her feet carried her through the village without conscious effort, as if some invisible force was guiding her along the path. She passed the bakery, the blacksmith, the old general store, all the familiar sights of a town that seemed perfectly safe, perfectly ordinary. But that nagging feeling grew stronger with every step. Before long, Claire found herself at the edge of the village, where the trees began to thin out, and the land opened up into a vast rolling meadow. In the distance, she could make out a small structure, an old, dilapidated chapel, its steeple leaning precariously to one side as though it had been forgotten by time itself. She wasn't sure why, but something about the chapel called to her. The tension in her chest seemed to ease as she looked at it, as though the answers she sought were hidden within its crumbling walls. Without thinking, Claire began walking toward the chapel, the world around her falling into a strange silence. Even the sounds of the village seemed distant now, muffled by the heavy weight of the moment. The closer she got, the more she felt a sense of urgency, as if she were being pulled by a force beyond her control. She had to reach the chapel. She didn't know why, but it felt like the missing piece of her journey, the final step she needed to take. As she approached the entrance, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was cool inside, carrying the scent of old wood and decay. The pews, worn and broken, were scattered haphazardly, and the stained glass windows, once vibrant, were now shattered and jagged. Yet, despite the chapel's state of disrepair, there was a strange stillness, a quiet reverence to the space. Claire stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a sense of completion, as though this place held the answers she had been searching for all along. She moved slowly, almost reverently, down the center aisle, the flickering light from the windows casting eerie shadows on the floor. At the altar, there was an old wooden chest, its surface etched with intricate carvings. Claire felt an undeniable pull toward it, as if the chest held the key to unlocking the mystery of everything she had been through. Her heart raced in anticipation as she approached it. With trembling hands, Claire reached for the lid of the chest. As her fingers brushed the surface, a sudden chill ran through her body, and for a moment she hesitated. The fear, the uncertainty, returned in a flash, but she refused to let it control her. She had come this far, faced so many horrors, and now she was ready to confront whatever lay within. With a deep breath, she opened the chest. Inside, there was nothing but a single folded piece of parchment. Claire's heart sank, and for a moment, she felt the bitter sting of disappointment. Was this all there was? A piece of paper, empty of meaning? But as she reached for it and unfolded it, her eyes widened in shock. The paper was covered in writing, words that seemed to shift and change as she read them. The ink was dark, almost black, but there was something strange about it, something alive, as though the words themselves were watching her. "You have found the truth, Claire," the words seemed to say, but they didn't come from the paper. They echoed in her mind, like a whisper in the darkness. "You have faced your fears, confronted the shadows, but the journey is far from over. There is always more to uncover, always more to face. You are not done." The words continued to shift, fading in and out of clarity. Some letters twisted, while others blurred together, but the meaning was clear. The shadows are not gone. They are waiting, and so are you. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the chapel seemed to darken. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the walls seemed to close in around her. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, but this time she knew what it was. The shadow had never truly left. It had merely bided its time, waiting for her to come to this place. The truth had been right there all along. And now, Claire was no longer running. The shadows shifted in the corners of the chapel, coiling like smoke. A low, guttural sound filled the air, a whisper that was both familiar and terrifying. Claire didn't need to look to know that something was moving toward her. The figure that had haunted her from the very beginning had found her once more. But this time, she was ready. This time, she was no longer afraid. The air in the chapel grew colder still, and the darkness around Claire deepened, curling into every corner like a living entity. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear, only resolve. She had come this far. She couldn't back down now. The figure in the shadows grew clearer, a shape emerging from the gloom. It was tall, its form indistinct but menacing, moving with an unnatural grace. Claire's grip on the parchment tightened, the words still shifting in her mind like an incantation. The whispering grew louder now, not in her ears, but inside her thoughts, rattling her very soul. "Did you think you could escape?" The voice echoed, its tone deep, hollow, and full of ancient malice. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her, pressing against her mind. Claire stood her ground, her body tense but unyielding. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered to the shadows, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "You can't control me." The figure paused, its shape flickering in and out of clarity like a shadow cast by an unseen flame. There was something impossibly ancient about it, something that hinted at ages beyond her understanding. "You were always part of me," the figure said, its voice now calm, almost soothing, as if it was trying to lull her into submission. "You cannot be free. You are bound to me, bound to the darkness, bound to the fear that courses through your veins." Claire's pulse raced as the figure took a step forward, its presence overwhelming her senses. The shadows seemed to bleed out from its form, filling the chapel with an oppressive weight. The light from the shattered stained glass windows barely cut through the thickening gloom. She felt a coldness seep into her bones, but she held her ground. "I don't belong to you," Claire declared with more strength than she had ever felt. "You were a part of my past, but not my future. I'm free of you." The figure did not respond. It merely raised its hand, long fingers like claws stretching toward her. She could feel the pull again, that insidious force drawing her closer, like gravity itself was bending to its will. But Claire wasn't afraid. She wasn't the same person who had stumbled into this chapel hours ago. She wasn't the same person who had been running for so long. With a deep breath, Claire stepped forward, meeting the figure halfway. It recoiled for the briefest of moments, as though surprised by her defiance. The shadows around it flickered, writhing and twisting, but Claire did not back away. She reached into her pocket, feeling the cool, smooth edges of the small stone she had found earlier in her journey. It was simple, just a piece of rock she had picked up from the well, but something about it had always felt powerful. In her hand, the stone began to glow faintly, a soft, warm light that seemed to push back the darkness. The figure hissed, its form shuddering as though in pain, but Claire didn't stop. She raised her hand, the stone glowing brighter now, the light expanding to fill the entire chapel. "You're not part of me anymore," Claire said again, her voice calm but resolute. "I have control now." The figure shrieked, a sound so loud it rattled the walls of the chapel, and the shadows around it began to writhe, tearing at the very fabric of the space. The air grew thick with an unnatural pressure, but Claire stood firm, focusing on the light from the stone. The glow intensified, pulsing with a strength she didn't know she had, pushing against the figure's dark presence. With one final, desperate scream, the figure recoiled into the shadows, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The darkness retreated, slowly at first, then faster, until it vanished completely. The coldness dissipated, and the chapel returned to its stillness. The oppressive weight lifted from the air, replaced by a calm that washed over Claire like a soothing balm. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. The shadows were gone. The figure, once so terrifying, had been banished. And in its place, Claire felt something new, a profound sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was truly alone in the chapel, but not in an empty, lonely way. No, this was a solitude she had earned, a space where the past no longer had a hold on her. Claire sank to her knees, her hands still clutching the stone, which had now lost its glow. The journey had been long, fraught with fear and uncertainty, but she had overcome it. She had faced the darkness, looked it in the eyes, and emerged victorious. The figure, the fear, the shadows, they were all part of her past now, just like the village she had left behind. She had moved beyond them, found her strength, and claimed her freedom. With a final, steadying breath, Claire stood up, leaving the chapel behind. She walked out into the daylight, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had finally broken free. The shadows were gone, and whatever the future held, Claire knew one thing for certain: she was ready for it. Claire walked away from the chapel, the weight of the encounter slowly lifting from her shoulders. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the meadow. As she moved further from the old building, the world around her seemed to settle into a quiet normalcy, but something deep inside her knew that this was not the end of her journey. The figure in the chapel had been banished, but the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, in ways she couldn't yet understand. She reached the edge of the village, her pace slowing as she gazed out at the familiar streets, now bathed in the warm glow of twilight. The people she had passed earlier in the square were gone, retreating into their homes for the night, but the quiet that settled over the village felt different now, peaceful yet somehow fragile. It was as though something had shifted, not in the world around her, but in herself. Claire's mind was still grappling with the events she had faced, the darkness she had confronted, and the strange feeling that the journey was far from over. Claire knew she had to leave the village, and yet something tugged at her heart. She had come here seeking answers, and while she had found some, others remained just beyond her reach. The feeling of being watched, of being pulled, still lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the sense that there was more to discover, more to uncover before she could truly move on. With a sigh, she turned away from the village and walked toward the nearby forest, the path winding deeper into the trees. The chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves filled the air, but there was a new layer of tension beneath it all. The woods felt darker than they had before, the shadows stretching long and unnatural, twisting with the wind. It was as though the land itself remembered the things that had happened, as though it carried a weight of its own secrets. Claire's steps were slow but purposeful, her hand resting on the hilt of the small knife she had carried since her early days of fear. The blade was a reminder of the battles she had fought, and of the strength she had discovered within herself. She had faced the figure in the chapel, banished it back into the darkness from which it had come, and she had learned that no shadow was too great to overcome. But the world was vast, and darkness, she knew, came in many forms. Her mind kept returning to the words on the parchment, the cryptic warning that the shadows were never truly gone. "There is always more to uncover," it had said. "There is always more to face." She wasn't sure what the future held, but she could feel the pull of the unknown deep within her chest, a quiet whisper that urged her to continue. There were more places to explore, more answers to find. And as she ventured deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger, like a calling from far away. The forest path narrowed as Claire continued onward, the trees towering around her like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The air was thick with the scent of earth and pine, and the ground beneath her feet was soft with fallen leaves. Yet, despite the beauty of the surroundings, there was a heaviness in the air. She could feel the weight of the forest closing in, the sensation of being watched returning in full force. She stopped for a moment, closing her eyes and listening. The sounds of the forest were louder now, more urgent, and something felt off. There was a slight shift in the atmosphere, a coldness that wasn't there before. Her instincts flared, and she reached for the knife at her side, ready to face whatever was coming. Then she heard it. A sound, faint at first, like the soft scrape of a shoe against the forest floor. Claire's heart skipped a beat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, drawing closer. She opened her eyes and scanned the shadows, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, and Claire tensed, her grip tightening on the knife. She wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and cloaked in darkness. The figure's face was hidden, its form indistinct against the backdrop of the night. It moved silently, gliding effortlessly through the woods, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't like the figure she had confronted in the chapel. This was something different. Something older. Without thinking, she stepped back, her mind racing for any idea of what to do next. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its mere existence sending waves of dread through her body. The forest seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't understand, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Who are you?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the silence, carrying an edge of defiance. The figure stopped, just out of reach, and for a long moment, there was no sound, no movement. Then it spoke. "You have come far, Claire." The voice was deep, impossibly low, and it seemed to reverberate through the air, sending chills down her spine. "But you are not yet free." Claire's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I'm not afraid of you." A low laugh, like the crackling of dry leaves, echoed through the trees. "You should be." Before she could react, the figure lunged forward, faster than she could register, its cloak swirling around it like smoke. Claire raised her knife instinctively, but the figure was already gone, disappearing into the darkness like a wisp of wind. The forest fell silent again, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, whatever it was, had been real, and it had come from the depths of the darkness she had been running from. But Claire wasn't done yet. The forest was full of shadows, and she had faced them before. She wasn't about to let them consume her again. With a steadying breath, she took a step forward, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. The darkness might follow her, but she would face it. She had to. The journey was far from over, and Claire was ready. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step Claire took. The air felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on her from all sides, and the rustling of the leaves in the trees sounded more like whispers, voices that carried the weight of ages. Her eyes darted around the shadows, every movement in the corner of her vision making her heart race. The feeling of being watched never left, and with each step, it only grew stronger. She had no idea who, or what, the figure was that had appeared before her, but she knew it wasn't done with her yet. Its cryptic words echoed in her mind, making her feel both unsettled and determined. "You are not yet free." The voice had been so low, so ancient, as if it had come from the very earth itself. Whatever this force was, it was connected to the darkness that had been hunting her for so long. The trees loomed above her, their twisted limbs resembling the fingers of ancient, sleeping giants. They seemed to stretch toward the sky, blocking out the last remnants of daylight as the sun dipped further behind the horizon. Claire's footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves beneath her boots, but she couldn't shake the feeling that every sound she made was too loud, too noticeable, drawing unwanted attention. The further she walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees formed an almost impenetrable canopy overhead, and the path seemed to narrow with each turn. It was as though the forest itself was alive, responding to her presence, and she couldn't escape its grip. Claire stopped for a moment, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She had been walking for what felt like hours, but the surroundings hadn't changed. The path had become a winding maze, and the air felt heavier with each passing minute. The eerie stillness of the forest was almost suffocating. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a force, and it had a will of its own, and she was in the center of it. She could hear it now, the soft scraping noise from earlier, like a distant scratching sound against bark. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It came from behind her, and Claire spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. She could see nothing in the dense dark of the woods, but the feeling of being pursued was palpable. Then, she heard the whispering. Soft at first, like wind rustling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was voices. "Come closer," the voices beckoned, just loud enough to be heard over the rustling of the leaves. "We've been waiting for you." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the air around her thickened, a strange pressure building within her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't let herself be swayed by fear again. Not now. Not after everything she had faced. With a deep breath, Claire stepped forward, slowly but steadily. The forest seemed to respond to her movement, shifting in ways she couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, and though the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, Claire could see a faint light far in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was there, a soft glow, almost like the moonlight breaking through the trees. Her steps quickened, her heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. The voices in the forest grew more insistent, more frantic, urging her to stop, to turn around. But Claire pushed forward, her legs moving with a purpose, as though the light was calling her. The glow grew brighter as she drew closer, and soon the trees parted, revealing a small clearing. At its center stood an old stone well, its surface worn and cracked with age. The light seemed to emanate from the well itself, a pale, ghostly glow that surrounded the stones like an ethereal mist. Claire hesitated, her mind racing. The well. It looked familiar. But how? She had never been here before. The whispers had died down now, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves. The wind had died completely, and the air was unervingly still. The silence was deafening. She slowly approached the well, her senses on high alert. The closer she got, the more her gut told her to turn back, to walk away, but she couldn't. Something compelled her to stand at its edge. Peering into the dark abyss of the well, she saw nothing but blackness, deep and unyielding. There was no water at the bottom, just an endless void stretching down into the earth. She shivered, a sudden chill crawling up her spine. And then she heard it, the sound of movement. Something from deep within the well, shifting, scraping against the stone walls. Claire's breath caught in her throat as a figure began to emerge from the darkness below. It was slow at first, a shape rising from the abyss, dragging itself upward with agonizing slowness. The figure's limbs were long and thin, like branches of an ancient tree twisted beyond recognition. Its skin was pale, sickly, as though it had been submerged in water for far too long. Claire took a step back, but her legs felt like stone. She couldn't move. The figure crept higher, its face still hidden by shadow, but Claire could feel its eyes on her, cold, unblinking eyes that pierced through the darkness. And then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was low, distorted, as though it had traveled through centuries to reach her. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. She could only stand there, frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure began to move closer, its body contorting unnaturally as it climbed out of the well. Each movement was accompanied by a sickening crack, as though its very bones were breaking with each inch it rose. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Claire felt herself suffocating under the weight of it. She forced herself to take a step back, her feet finally working again, but the figure was too fast. In a sudden burst of motion, it lunged toward her, its fingers stretching out to grab her. With a scream, Claire raised her knife, her hands trembling as she thrust it forward. The blade met something cold and hard, but the figure didn't stop. It twisted its body, and the knife was wrenched from her grasp as though it were weightless. The creature's grip closed around her wrist, its cold fingers like ice as they tightened with impossible strength. "You cannot escape," the figure hissed, its face finally emerging from the shadows. Claire's eyes widened in horror. The figure's face was gaunt and stretched, its skin pulled tight over its skull, leaving only dark hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It smiled at her, a slow, twisted grin, and Claire realized, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't just some creature of the forest. It had been waiting for her, and now it was time to claim her. The grip around Claire's wrist tightened, and the icy cold spread through her veins like poison. She struggled, trying to pull free, but her body felt like it was being weighed down by invisible chains. The figure leaned closer, its breath rancid and thick, as though it hadn't spoken in centuries. "You're not like the others," it rasped, its voice a twisted whisper. "You've come seeking answers, haven't you?" Claire's chest heaved as she gasped for air, her heart pounding in her ears. She could feel the pressure in her chest, the weight of the presence surrounding her, threatening to crush her from all sides. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. "Tell me," the figure continued, its grin widening impossibly, "what do you think you'll find here? What do you think you can escape from? This forest is not just a place, it is a prison that has kept me here for eons." Claire's blood ran cold as she realized the truth in its words. This wasn't just a creature of the woods, it was a part of the forest itself. A dark force that had been bound to this place, trapped for an eternity. It was the very thing that had been haunting her, pushing her toward the well. She had stumbled into its domain, into its lair. The figure's cold fingers gripped her wrist even tighter, pulling her forward with unnatural strength. Claire stumbled, barely able to keep her balance, as she was drawn closer to the dark depths of the well. The blackness within it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were calling her, beckoning her to join it. "No," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "No, I won't let you take me." The figure's laugh echoed through the air, a twisted sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You think you have a choice? You think you can escape what's been set in motion? There is no escape. Not from me. Not from this place." With one swift motion, it dragged Claire closer to the edge of the well, and she could feel the pull of the darkness below, a gravitational force that seemed to reach up toward her, eager to claim her. She clawed at the ground, desperately trying to hold on to anything that would keep her from falling into the abyss. But the creature's grip was unrelenting. "You were always meant to be here," it hissed, its voice vibrating in the air. "You were always destined to fall." The edges of Claire's vision began to blur, her body growing weaker with each passing second. The air grew colder, and the whispers in the forest began again, louder now, overlapping each other, creating a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak directly to her soul. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, as the darkness began to swallow her whole. The weight of the creature's presence pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. She wasn't sure whether it was the forest or the creature's power that was claiming her, but she knew that she was no longer in control. The world around her had become a blur of shadows, whispers, and cold. But just as she thought it was over, just as she thought she was being consumed by the darkness, a sudden burst of light broke through the shadows. A force, something pure, something powerful, cut through the suffocating darkness, sending the creature recoiling back. For a split second, Claire saw the figure's face twist into an expression of rage, but the light seemed to push it away, forcing it back into the depths of the well. The figure screamed in fury, its form flickering and distorting as it was dragged into the void below. Claire's body lurched backward, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air. She felt the ground beneath her, solid and real, as though she had been pulled from a nightmare into the waking world. The air around her was no longer suffocating, and the whispers had faded away, leaving only the sound of her ragged breaths. But she wasn't free. Not yet. Claire slowly pushed herself to her feet, trembling as she looked around the clearing. The well was still there, its dark depths staring back at her, but the oppressive weight of the creature's presence had lifted. The forest around her seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing. The figure was gone, at least for now. But Claire knew better than to believe it was over. She had felt its power, its connection to the forest, and she knew that it was just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But for now, Claire was alive. She turned away from the well, her legs shaky but determined. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, not in this place, not with the knowledge that something dark and ancient was watching her, waiting for the perfect opportunity to claim her. With a final glance at the well, Claire began to move toward the edge of the clearing, the forest opening up before her. The darkness seemed to retreat, and the quiet murmur of the wind returned. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever she had faced tonight, it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As Claire moved through the forest, the whispers that had once haunted her began to fade, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. No matter how far she walked, no matter how fast she ran, the forest would always be there, watching, waiting for her return. And deep within its dark heart, the creature waited as well, patient and eternal. As Claire continued to move through the dense woods, each step felt heavier than the last. The trees, which had once seemed so familiar, now towered over her like dark sentinels. Their branches, long and gnarled, seemed to reach out toward her as though they were alive, beckoning her back to the clearing. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. "You're safe," she told herself. But even as the words left her mind, a cold gust of wind stirred the leaves, sending a shiver up her spine. The path ahead of her was unclear, as if the forest itself was trying to confuse her, make her lost once again. Claire felt the pull of something deeper in the woods, something calling to her from the very depths of the earth. She quickened her pace, trying to ignore the increasing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The further she moved away from the clearing, the more unnatural the forest seemed. It felt wrong, like it had never wanted her to leave in the first place. The silence pressed in on her, thicker now, as if the forest itself had gone into hiding, waiting for something. Claire's breath came faster, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel her pulse in her temples, a constant reminder of the fear still bubbling just beneath the surface. There were no birds, no insects, nothing but the steady rustle of leaves as the wind picked up again, its cold breath licking at her skin. Then, out of nowhere, a sound broke the silence. A low, guttural growl. Claire froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of the sound, but there was nothing. The growl wasn't a distant echo. It was close. Too close. Her hands trembled, and she slowly turned, scanning the shadows. There was no movement, no sign of anything that could have made the sound. The forest was still. "It's just the wind," she thought desperately. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a series of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Claire's blood ran cold. This was no animal. This was something far worse, something with a purpose. And it was hunting her. She turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the forest itself was bending, distorting to trap her. The trees leaned in closer, their shadows stretching out like long, bony fingers reaching for her. She ran faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but it felt as if the path was closing in on her, as if she were running in circles. The growls grew louder, closer, until Claire could feel them vibrating in her bones. She pushed harder, desperate to escape, but her legs were growing weak. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she could just make out the movement in the shadows. Something was following her, keeping pace with her every step. A burst of adrenaline surged through her as she darted between two massive trees, trying to break free from the invisible grip of the forest. But before she could get far, a shadow flashed across her path, blocking her way. She skidded to a stop, her eyes wide in horror. A figure stood in front of her. It was tall, taller than any person she had ever seen, and it was cloaked in darkness. Its face was hidden in the folds of its black, tattered cloak, but Claire could feel its eyes on her. Cold, empty, hungry. The growl rumbled from its throat, the sound so deep and resonant that it shook the very air around them. Claire took a step back, her pulse quickening. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself against whatever this thing was. The creature's form shifted, the darkness around it swirling and twisting, as if the forest itself was feeding off its presence. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature said in a voice that was both human and something else entirely. Something older. Something that had existed far longer than any human had. The words sent chills down Claire's spine. The forest calls to those who seek the answers, but it's not so kind to those who wander too far. Claire's throat tightened, and she felt a lump form in it. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak. What do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head, its gaze never leaving hers. It was studying her, its black eyes reflecting nothing but the shadows. "I've waited so long," it rasped, "and now you are here. The last piece of the puzzle. The one who can complete the cycle." Claire's breath hitched. "What cycle? What do you mean?" It chuckled darkly, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves in a storm. "The cycle of the lost. The souls who enter the forest, seeking knowledge they were never meant to possess. Those who cross the threshold can never return. And now, you are one of them." A surge of fear swept through Claire's chest. Her mind raced as the realization hit her. There was no way out of this. Not for her. Not now. She had been marked, chosen by the forest, and it would not let her leave. The creature moved closer, its form still cloaked in shadows, but now Claire could see the faintest outline of something unnatural beneath the cloak, something with claws, something with teeth. It reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, brushing against her cheek with a coldness that felt like death itself. "I will show you the truth," it whispered, "but you may not survive to understand it." Claire's stomach churned as the creature's grip tightened around her wrist, dragging her closer. The dark whispers of the forest returned, louder now, swirling around them like an angry storm. And Claire realized, with a sickening certainty, that the forest was alive. It was the forest. There was no escape, only the darkness. The creature's grip on Claire's wrist tightened, and she felt her body being pulled toward it, the darkness surrounding her growing heavier with each step she was forced to take. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every breath she took felt like it would be her last. The forest seemed to close in around them, its gnarled trees twisting and shifting, as though they were closing ranks to trap her in its deadly embrace. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head, its eyes glinting with something ancient and malicious. It released a low, gravelly chuckle, one that sent a wave of terror crashing through Claire's chest. "What I want," it said slowly, its voice trailing off into a hiss, "is for you to see the truth. The truth of this place. The truth of what it is." Claire's heart raced, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Her body felt weak, her limbs heavy, as though they no longer belonged to her. The pull of the darkness grew stronger, and it was all she could do to stand, to keep herself from being dragged into the abyss that yawned before her. She could hear whispers again, louder now, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but she could feel their cold touch on her skin, creeping under her clothes, settling deep in her bones. "You are not the first to come here," the creature continued, its voice soft but filled with an undeniable malice. "No. Many have wandered into this place, seeking answers. But answers are not what they find. They find nothing." Claire felt a sharp pang in her chest as the creature's words hit her. She had come seeking answers. She had thought she could solve the mystery of the well, of the darkness that had haunted her dreams. But now, it seemed, those answers were never meant for her. The forest had led her here to show her one final truth, one that could never be undone. "You see," the creature murmured, leaning closer, "the forest is alive, and it feeds on the souls of those who seek it. You were drawn here not by chance, but by a need, something deep within you. A darkness, a hunger." Claire's mind reeled. Her stomach twisted in on itself as she fought to stay standing. "No," she thought. "No, I won't let it take me. I won't become one of them." But the creature was right. She had been drawn to this place by something dark, something inside her that had been waiting for this moment. She had felt it ever since she first heard the whispers, ever since she had seen the dark shape looming in her dreams. It had always been there, pulling her toward this cursed forest, toward its heart. The creature's fingers brushed against her skin, cold as death. "You have no choice now," it hissed. "You will be part of the forest. You will join the others." Claire's eyes darted around the clearing, her mind frantic. She couldn't give in. She couldn't become another lost soul wandering the woods, trapped forever in the dark. But the creature's presence was suffocating, its power so overwhelming that her knees buckled beneath her. She felt herself falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of the creature's voice, echoing in her ears. "There is no escape." When Claire awoke, she was lying on the cold forest floor, her body stiff and aching. The air was still, the whispers gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. She pushed herself up, her vision swimming as she blinked in the dim light. It took a moment for her to realize what had happened. The forest had released her, only for now. She wasn't free, not really. There was no escape. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. The path ahead of her was unclear, just as it had been before. The darkness stretched on, far deeper than she could see, and Claire knew, with terrifying certainty, that she had crossed a line she could never return from. The forest had claimed her, and no matter how far she ran, no matter where she went, she would never truly leave. She stood, the weight of the creature's presence still heavy on her shoulders, and began to walk once more into the heart of the forest. Her footsteps were silent, swallowed by the thick underbrush. The wind whispered again, soft at first, but then it grew louder, curling through the trees like a serpent. Claire could feel it on her skin, like a cold, unseen hand reaching for her. And then, just when she thought she could hear the growls of the creature again, a sudden stillness fell over the forest. No wind, no movement, only silence. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. The forest was waiting for her next step, watching her every move. As Claire walked deeper into the woods, she realized the truth. She had become part of this place, part of its cycle. There was no escaping it. The forest had claimed her, body and soul, and she would never be free. But deep in the darkness, she couldn't help but wonder, what had become of those who came before her? What had become of the other lost souls, the ones who had never made it out? The forest would keep their memories. She knew that. It would keep them forever, hidden in the depths of the earth, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in and join them. The whispers started again, soft and soothing, as though welcoming her back into the fold. And Claire, though filled with terror, couldn't help but listen. For she had learned one undeniable truth that night. There is no escape from the forest. Not for anyone. Not for her. And now it was her turn to wait, to watch, to claim. Her heart skipped a beat, but as the figure drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him. It was something else, something dark. The forest wasn't done with her yet. Rachel turned, her breath quickening as the shadows of the woods closed in around her once more. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.